Welcome to the channel. Today, we're taking you back to the bloodless stone walls of the Center Ages, a time when refrigerators hadn't been invented yet. So, how did individuals hold their meat, dairy products, fruits, and greens fresh? What approaches allowed them to retail their meals without it spoiling? On this video, we'll discover forgotten preservation methods, accompanied by small details from everyday lifestyles in that era. As you watch, feel to yourself, would I trying this kind of method at present, and share your ideas in the comments. If you happen to enjoy discovering the calm but fascinating small print of history, don't fail to remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. Each video here takes you on a quiet ride via time. In the event you're equipped, let's uncovering the hidden meals, storage methods of the medieval kitchen. Within the long centuries that made up the medieval generation, day-to-day lifestyles unfolded in a rhythm shaped no longer by means of the fast PC of state-of-the-art industry. However, with the aid of the gradual turning of the seasons, the slow progress of crops, and the quiet work of human fingers, in such a world, the proposal of mechanical refrigeration used to be thoroughly unknown. But the need to maintain food was once as constant as the need for water, refuge, and warmth. For peasants, townsfolk, and the aristocracy alike, maintaining food fit for human consumption for longer than a couple of days could imply the change between comfort and complication, between a good-fed winter and a season of shortage. The absence of refrigerators didn't mean the absence of ingenuity. Throughout fields, villages, castles, and monasteries, humans developed methods, some historical, some tailored to the occasions, to keep perishable items from spoiling too swiftly. These practices, handed down by way of generations, relied on an intimate capabilities of ordinary approaches and the environment. The approaches had been easy by way of today's requirements, but they were born from cautious commentary, a sufferer working out of the connection between temperature, moisture, and the gradual progression of decay. Earlier than diving into the designated ways themselves, it is foremost to understand the context where they arose. Medieval communities lived carefully tied to the land. Markets didn't operate every day in every village, and in rural areas, a family typically relied on what it would grow, accumulate, or produce within a small radius. The harvest used to be a time of abundance, but abundance was fleeting, and without education, a lot of it could be lost before wintry weather arrived. The developing season had to provide now, not only for immediate consumption, but in addition for the lengthy months when the earth lay dormant beneath frost or snow. This fact shaped the way persons' proposal about food, no longer as something always replenished from a far-off supply chain, but as a restricted useful resource to be managed with care. Unique areas had unique challenges. In cooler northern climates, the ordinary sit-back of the environment might be used to sluggish spoilage, notably throughout autumn and iciness. In hotter southern lands, the battle against heat and humidity required more lively methods, mainly involving drying, salting, or storing meals in sealed containers. The forms of food on hand also influenced upkeep methods. Fish in coastal areas, grains in fertile farmlands, root greens in less warm zones, and fruits in orchards all required one-of-a-kind tactics. It's worth noting that medieval upkeep ways weren't purely about survival. They also formed the flavors and textures of food in approaches that became familiar and even fascinating. Salted meats had a special firmness and saltiness that individuals came to assume. Dried fruits developed scented sweetness. Fermented meals received tangy, earthy notes that became part of the culinary way of life. As a consequence, maintenance was once not without difficulty. A subject of preserving food from rotting it additionally contributed to the identification of regional cuisines. In monasteries, where schedules had been disciplined and storage carefully planned, maintenance took on a quite exclusive dimension. Monks most commonly maintained cellars, smokehouses, and storerooms that might maintain months' value debt of provisions. For journeying retailers, the quandary was portability as much as longevity, made to preserve meals that would stand up to lengthy journeys on the avenue or sea. Even for the wealthy, whose kitchens were staffed via skilled cooks, the mission of maintaining a kind of foods available throughout the 12 months required cautious planning, for the reason that contemporary produce and dairy might now not simply be summoned at will. The medieval household, whether or not humble or grand, relied on a combination of techniques to take advantage of what the land and season offered. These procedures were not invented overnight. Many were inherited from prior centuries, tailored and subtle over time. The potential behind them used to be realistic, rooted in day-to-day necessity, and normally learned through statement alternatively, then formal guide. A baby developing up in a medieval village would see their elders grasp herbs to dry in the rafters, PC greens into clay jars, or bury specified roots in cool earth, and over time they would come to have an understanding of no longer only how these methods have been carried out, however, why they labored. The primary protection tactics we will compare are people, who required little beyond the traditional atmosphere, and a patient procedure methods that used the air, the sun, and the ground as silent partners in preserving meals reliable for longer periods. These were the most available strategies, practiced in households of each size, and so they formed the foundation upon which extra problematic ways have been developed. Earlier than relocating to extra specialized practices, it is in these quiet, traditionally overpassed routines that we find the day-to-day rhythm of medieval food preservation, a rhythm in which time and nature worked in cooperation with human need. In a world without equipment to keep an eye on temperature, medieval individuals turned to the gradual, regular forces of nature itself. Cooling used to be done now, not by way of unexpected technological intervention, but through finding and utilizing spaces that placed the air remained naturally cold, where the sun's attain used to be constrained, and where moisture would be managed. These areas, whether under the earth, inside thick-walled buildings, or close typical our bodies of water, had been as fundamental to meals protection as any ingredient or instrument. Probably the most easiest and most universal approach is used to be the use of cellars. These weren't the neat, prepared basements of contemporary homes, but more often than not, hard, stone-lined, or earth-walled chambers dug below residences, barns, or storage constructions. Here, insulated by way of the encircling soil, temperatures remained appreciably cooler than above floor, especially in summer season. The thick walls trapped the coolness of winter and resisted the warmth of the warmer months. While no longer bloodless adequate to freeze, these stipulations slowed the development of mold and bacteria, extending the lifetime of stored food. In such cellars, root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips have been stored in picket boxes or woven baskets, sometimes packed in damp sand to maintain moisture and avoid shriveling. Cabbages, probably saved entire, stacked in layers with straw between them. Apples and pears, harvested at the right stage of ripeness, might last for weeks or even months if stored in an area that placed the air circulated gently and humidity stayed balanced. The potential of how you can stack, PC, and separate distinctive plants to avoid spoilage used to be handed along in the quiet rhythm of family guideline. As a rule, without written document, some storage took location no longer in developed cellars but directly within the earth. In rural areas, pits have been dug into the ground, lined with straw, and stuffed with veggies or fruits before being sealed over with extra straw and soil. This process, identified in some regions as clamp storage, saved the contents cool and protected from frost, even as the insulating layers shielded them from rodents and insects. Such buried retailers were invisible to the informal passerby, making them less prone to theft for the duration of tough winters. Seasonal timing was once equally fundamental. Specified meals had been harvested or prepared for storage handist when stipulations have been most favorable. In colder climates, slaughtering animals for meat used to be ordinarily finished in late autumn, when falling temperatures would naturally help in maintenance. The cold air and floor acted as an enormous, slow-working refrigerator, keeping the meat from spoiling earlier than it might be salted, smoked, or otherwise handled. In mountainous or northern regions, ice and snow had been in many instances packed into insulated pits or stone chambers to create primitive ice houses, allowing targeted foods to be kept cool well into the hotter months. Water, too, could be a tool for cooling. In some places, containers of milk, butter, or other perishables had been positioned in material baggage and suspended in wells, where the surrounding water kept them cool. In other instances, streams or spring-fed troughs served as common refrigeration, the moving water carrying away heat and helping hinder bacterial development. Such methods required attentiveness, for a sudden rise in temperature or infection from the water source might rapidly undo the maintenance effort. These usual cooling methods, though general, had been the spine of medieval meal storage. They required no problematic gear, handiest consciousness of the environment, and capability to work with its rhythms. The areas themselves have been frequently dim, quiet, and unremarkable, yet they carried an importance equal to the hearth or the granary. Right here, meals waited in a sort of suspended time, sheltered from the on-the-spot pressures of decay, capable to be brought into the kitchen when needed. In the next section, we will flip from the nonetheless coolness of the earth and water to the transformative energy of the solar and air approaches that did not purely slow but altered the meals itself, altering its texture and taste in the process. These drying and smoking strategies, practiced in kitchens, yards, and smokehouses, had been as a lot part of the medieval landscape because the ploughed field or the village inexperienced, where the cool and dark of cellars and earth pits preserved food via slowing nature's procedures, the solar, the open air, and the slow curl of wooden smoke preserved it by changing its very state. In the core, a while, these methods did not, with no trouble, delay spoilage. They altered the feel, style, and even the identity of the food, creating products that had been both durable and distinct. For folks accustomed to seasonal shortage, such transformations were not luxuries. They had been requirements that ensured a more comfortable supply via the year. Drying was once among the many oldest and easiest maintenance systems, requiring little more than a suitable area and favorable weather. In warmer months, fruits equivalent to plums, figs, and grapes might be laid out on woven mats or picket frames, their surfaces exposed to the steady heat of the solar. Over days and even weeks, moisture evaporated from the fruit, concentrating its sugars and making a dense, chewy texture. These dried fruits, stored in linen sacks or ceramic jars, might final for months without further cure, providing a priceless supply of sweetness within the wintry weather diet. Greens, too, might be dried. In distinctive areas, peas, beans, and lentils were spread out in thin layers, stirred now and again to ensure even drying, and later stored in material bags or barrels. As soon as dried, they would be rehydrated in stews and soups, restoring a lot of their common texture. Herbs had been possibly the most commonly dried vegetation within the medieval family, their small leaves and thin stems making them easy to maintain. Bundles of thyme, sage and rosemary hung from rafters, their fragrance filling the air as they slowly lost their moisture. For meat and fish, air drying most of the time worked in mixture with salting or smoking. Along coastal areas, giant portions of fish had been cut up open, salted, and hung on wooden racks to dry within the wind. In less warm northern climates, cod was once a normal candidate for this approach, fitting the durable stockfish that might be traded or stored for years. Inland, strips of venison, pork, or mutton possibly hung in cool, ethereal lofts, protected from insects with the aid of skinny cloth coverings. Smoking brought an additional dimension to upkeep by using hanging meat or fish in a smokehouse or above the fireplace, where wooden fires burned for long hours. Folks no longer only dried the food, but infused it with compounds from the smoke that inhibited bacterial growth. The method would take days, with the meals absorbing a deep, savory aroma. Specific woods produced distinctive flavors very well for a mighty, hearty style. Fruit woods for a lighter, reasonably sweet scent. In many rural properties, the smoke from the cooking fireplace rose to the rafters, passing over hams, sausages, and facets of Sir Francis Bacon hung from beams. These excessive, shadowed spaces grew to be part of the maintenance process, their regular heat and smoke slowly reworking the food. It's major to take into account that in the medieval mind, protection and taste were not separate ideas. A smoked ham was once not readily a recent ham made more long-lasting. It was once a further food thoroughly, with its possess location within the weight loss plan. These preserved meals would be eaten on their possess, or used to flavor different dishes, lending depth to soups, stews, and porridges. During the winter months, the labor worried in drying and smoking was once, by and large, constant rather than hurried, turning the food to ensure even drying, keeping the right quantity of warmness and smoke, checking for indicators of spoilage. These were tasks that might be applied alongside other day-to-day work. The spaces where these methods took position had been typically realistic. Open-sided sheds, small picket smokehouses, or sections of the kitchen itself. The sight of rows of fish swaying gently within the breeze, or the scent of slow-burning wooden drifting from a smokehouse was a fashioned characteristic of many medieval communities. In the next section, we will be able to flip from these outdoor and semi-outdoor methods to the use of components that could preserve food from within: salt, vinegar, honey, and other common substances that acted not just as seasonings, but as obstacles towards time and decay. These were approaches where human intervention played a higher role, counting on expertise of percentage, practice, and endurance. At the same time, cooling, drying, and smoking relied generally on environmental conditions. The usage of certain materials to hold meals mirrored an extra energetic and deliberate type of manage. In the Middle Ages, salt, vinegar, honey, and more than a few spices weren't purely flavorings, they were protecting agents, in a position of extending the life of perishable foods a ways past their typical limits. These components worked with the aid of creating environments wherein bacteria and molds struggled to grow, and their careful use used to be a talent learned by means of long experience. Salt was probably the most widely employed preservative. Its capability to draw moisture out of both food and microorganisms made it a powerful deterrent to decay. Meat renovation by way of salting was once practiced at each social stage, although the dimensions differed commonly. In rich households and monastic communities, complete facets of red meat or pork would be packed in massive wooden barrels, layered thickly with coarse salt. In humbler properties, smaller cuts or fish had been treated within the identical method. The process was easy but required awareness. The salt needed to be replenished as it absorbed moisture, and the storage conditions needed to remain cool and dry. As soon as preserved, the meat could be soaked in water before cooking to minimize the saltiness, though even after soaking it retained a distinctive cured flavor. Fish, exceptionally in coastal and river areas, had been closely stylish on salting. For preservation, herring, cod, and mackerel might be gutted, cleaned, and then layered with salt before being packed for storage or transport. Salted fish used to be a staple for a lot of communities, particularly in the course of devout fasting. Durations when meat was once forbidden. The salted product could final for a lot of months, its sturdiness making it a valuable alternate. Just right, as well as a source of sustenance. Vinegar furnished a different procedure to maintenance, primarily for vegetables and a few fruits, created from the gradual fermentation of wine, ale, or cider. Vinegar was naturally acidic, developing an inhospitable environment for detrimental microbes. In pickling, greens comparable to onions, cucumbers, or cabbage have been submerged in vinegar, generally with the addition of herbs and spices. This no longer most effective preserved their texture and averted spoilage, but also imparted a tangy taste that brightened in any other case easy meals. Pickled meals were valuable throughout the winter, when recent produce used to be scarce, and they offered kind in each style and texture. Honey, although necessary and pricey in many regions, had a detailed position in medieval renovation. Its high sugar content material and low water content material made it naturally resistant to microbial progress. Small fruits, akin to berries, could be suspended in honey, creating a sweet hold that will last for months. In some instances, even meat or fish used to be coated in honey as a brief time period measure to defend it from the air. The use of honey for upkeep was once extra long established in wealthier households. The place beekeeping was practiced or where honey might be bought in sufficient number. Targeted spices, although by and large high-priced because of long trade. Roots also performed a position. Cloves, cinnamon, and pepper had slight antimicrobial properties. However, their main contribution was once in covering any changes in taste that befell during storage. On this field, they labored in partnership with different approaches. Salted meat might be stewed with spices to create a more palatable dish. For illustration, or pickled vegetables may be flavored with dill or mustard seeds. The careful use of those ingredients required capabilities of proportion and timing. Too little salt, and the preservation would fail. Too much, and the meals would become unpleasantly tough or inedible. Vinegar needed to be robust, sufficient to work readily, and honey needed to be kept free from moisture contamination. These were not procedures that could be rushed. They unfolded at their possessed percent, guided by way of the sluggish certainty of chemical change, and the results had been relied on to hold households by means of the lean months. Within the next part, we will be able to flip to fermentation, a procedure that no longer only preserved food, but also converted it into something entirely new. From bitter breads to sharp cheeses and tangy ales, fermentation used to be both a useful necessity and a cornerstone of medieval culinary tradition. Among the protection approaches of the center, while fermentation was once maybe the most difficult in its techniques, but the most acquainted in its results. Unlike cooling or salting, which worked notably to gradual or halt decay, fermentation relied on carefully encouraging targeted varieties of microbial undertaking, at the same time discouraging others. The effect used to be no longer simply the upkeep of meals, but its transformation into something unique, extra flavorful, more digestible, and almost always more nutritious than the common. Fermentation was, in many circumstances, a traditional occurrence, seen long before it used to be wholly understood. Bread left to relaxation would repeatedly upward thrust on its possess. Milk left in a fat place would sour and thicken, and overwhelmed grapes or grain left in a vessel would to bubble and change in style. Over time, medieval people realized how to guide these changes, favoring effects that produced steady, fit-to-be-eaten products rather than this knowledge was generally useful, handed down by means of loved ones. Observe brewing traditions and monastic maintaining. Alternatively, then by means of scientific explanation, cheesemaking is likely one of the clearest examples of fermentation as protection. Recent milk, extremely perishable on its own, could be transformed into a sort of cheeses that might last for weeks, months, and even longer. By adding rennet and enabling worthwhile bacteria to improve, the milk would curdle, keeping apart into curds and whey. The curds had been then pressed, salted, and often aged in cool, dry spaces. Each neighborhood developed its own styles, from gentle, contemporary cheeses to rough sorts that would face up to long storage. Cheese was more than only a preserved type of milk. It used to be a portable, focused supply of vitamin, main in both rural and concrete diets. Fermented drinks reminiscent of ale, beer, cider, and wine had been also crucial to medieval existence. Brewing used to be a well-known skill, and in lots of households, ale was once produced in general for everyday consumption. The fermentation method, now not most effective, created alcohol, which itself acted as a preservative, but in addition eliminated hazardous microorganisms that might be rewarded in untreated water. Monasteries, on the whole, brewed beer or wine, both for their possessed use and for sale, refining recipes over centuries. These drinks would be stored for varying lengths of time, relying on their strength and storage conditions, delivering a reliable beverage when recent water provides have been unsure. Vegetable fermentation, whilst maybe much less celebrated, was once equally main. Sauerkraut, made by way of layering shredded cabbage with salt and enabling it to ferment in its own juices, would final by means of the iciness months and provided predominant vitamins. Identical ways were applied to different greens, almost always with variance in seasoning relying on regional tastes and to be had herbs. These fermented vegetables were not handiest to look after in opposition to scarcity, but also a welcome trade in taste during lengthy seasons of preserved and dried meals. Fermentation also played a function in bread making, particularly in the use of sourdough starters in areas without entry to industrial yeast, which, in the medieval interval, did not but exist in its latest kind. Bakers relied on naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria within the air and within the flour itself. A portion of fermented dough could be stored, excluding each batch, and used to leaven the next. This system produced bread that was once more immune to spoilage than unleavened varieties, in particular when baked into dense loaves that would be stored for days or weeks. The areas where fermentation took location had been usually traditional, but quietly managed environments: cool storerooms, covered barrels and cellars, earthenware jars saved out of direct daylight. The important thing was balance, enough heat to inspire the preferred transformation, ample coolness to avoid the method from turning toward decay. Folks that labored with fermentation realized to read delicate signs: the scent of ripening curds, the color of fermenting cabbage, the bubbling sound of ale in its cask. And to behave for this reason. In the subsequent part, we will be able to depart in the back of these ways that required patient transformation and switch to the function of storage vessels themselves. How timber, clay, glass, and metallic were used not best to contain food, but to guard it from the numerous forces that might shorten its existence. Even as cooling, drying, salting, and fermenting all formed the durability of meals. The option of storage vessel was once equally predominant. Within the core a while, containers were not passive objects, they had been energetic members in preservation, controlling publicity to air, moisture, pests, and light. The substances, shapes, and sealing approaches of these vessels had been the result of centuries of useful refinement, guided via each availability and necessity. Clay used to be among the most customary substances. Earthenware jars and pots, usually glazed on the within to cut back porosity, would preserve drinks such as oil, vinegar, wine, or syrup, without permitting them to seep away. These containers might additionally retail dry goods, similar to grain, beans, and dried fruit, protecting them from rodents and bugs when sealed with a lid, fabric, or wax. In some instances, the mouth of a jar used to be closed with a bit of parchment or leather tied tightly with string, making a barrier to pests and air. Clay vessels had been low-priced to provide in the neighborhood, and their cool, stable interiors made them suitable for many forms of meals. Wooden used to be a different versatile material, used within the form of barrels, tubs, and packing containers. The medieval barrel was once greater than only a delivery container, it was a upkeep software. Its curved staves, bound tightly via iron hoops, created a vessel powerful enough to hold beverages or to resist the pressure of fermenting beer or cider. Barrels of salted fish, pickled veggies, or cured meats might be stacked in storerooms or transported over lengthy distances without huge lack of satisfactory. For dry items, picket chests or boxes lined with fabric provided plentiful security from vermin and dirt. Glass, although rarer and extra pricey, was once valued for its impermeability and its capacity to show the contents inside of. It was once mostly used for maintaining beverages akin to oils, medicinal syrups, or satisfactory wines. In some wealthier households, fruits preserved in honey or sugar syrup, perhaps stored in glass jars, each for their defense and for the unique show of their colors. Due to the fact that glass was once fragile, it was now not suited for storage or transport. However, it excelled in maintaining smaller, valuable portions of food. Steel played a more limited position. Iron or copper vessels have been more commonly reserved for cooking as an alternative than lengthy time period storage, though tin-lined containers would typically hold dry items or prepared foods. In exact instances, small metal containers have been used to hold meals on journeys, their tight-fitting lids providing short time period defense. Sealing ways were as principal as the vessel itself. Wax was used to coat material covers or to seal the tops of jars, creating an hermetic layer that avoided mold development and slowed spot. Fat could also function as sealant. Potted meats, for instance, were cooked, placed in a pot, and protected with a layer of rendered fats that hardened because it cooled, retaining out air and microorganism. For barrels, tight becoming picket, bungs stored beverages, cozy even as allowing for occasional entry. Placement mattered too. Even probably the most cautiously made vessel might fail if saved in the improper atmosphere. A barrel of salted meat kept in a humid shed could absorb an excessive amount of moisture and smash. A jar of honey placed near warmth might ferment unintentionally. The alternative of place, whether or not a shaded nook of a storeroom, a groovy cellar, or a raised shelf away from pests, used to be a part of the protection technique. These containers have been, in lots of methods, silent guardians of the household's food deliver. They didn't exchange the food in the way fermentation or smoking did. However, they ensured that the results of those techniques would be loved 4 months later on. Their shapes and designs diverse by using area. However, their rationale was once universal, to maintain the family's reserves in opposition to the uncertainties of the seasons. Within the next and ultimate part, we can step again from the individual methods and recollect the rhythm of upkeep as a entire, how these approaches fit into the annual cycle of medieval existence, and the way the careful administration of meal storage used to be no longer only a subject of necessity, but a valuable part of the medieval manner of living. Within the core ages, food upkeep used to be now not an occasional mission, nor used to be it a specialized craft left to a choose few. It was a steady, cyclical system woven into the fabric of daily lifestyles, intently aligned with the turning of the seasons and the gradual rhythm of agricultural work. Every family, whether in a rural village, a bustling city, or a fortified manor, participated on this rhythm, for it was once the one solution to make sure that the abundance of one season might sustain the people by means of the scarcity of one more. The work started in spring, as the first contemporary vegetables emerged and the outlets of the previous year ran low. This used to be a time of transition, when the preserved meals from the earlier harvest, dried beans, salted meats, pickled vegetables, have been regularly changed by way of contemporary produce. Renovation was minimal in these early months, targeted extra on utilizing the last of the ancient presents and getting ready the tools and spaces that will be needed later in the year. Cellars were cleaned, barrels inspected, and jars mended or changed. Summer season brought the primary actual rush of preservation work. Early fruits had been dried in the sun or preserved in honey. Herbs had been gathered and hung to dry. At the same time, their oils had been at their most robust. Fish catches, peculiarly in coastal areas, have been at times plentiful, requiring instant salting, smoking, or drying to prevent waste. Veggies ripened in waves, each kind calling for its possess. Procedure: peas shelled and dried, cucumbers packed into vinegar, cabbages set aside for fermentation. The lengthy days furnished both the heat and the light for these duties, though they also introduced the hazard of rapid spoilage if work was delayed. Autumn was once the exceptional season of abundance and preparation. Grains have been harvested and saved in dry, rodent-proof granaries. Apples and pears have been carefully picked for cellar storage or pressed into cider. The slaughtering of cattle took location in these cooler months, the falling temperatures performing as a usual help to maintenance. Large quantities of meat were salted, smoked, or potted in fats, meant final by way of the lengthy iciness. This used to be additionally the time for making cheese from the last of the season's milk, for brewing beer and wine to store in barrels, and for filling each available vessel with provisions. Wintry weather used to be the season of reliance. The success or failure of the renovation work grew to be most apparent. Recent meals was scarce, restrained to hardy veggies that had been stored in cellars or buried within the floor. Meals drew closely on the salted meats, dried grains, pickled veggies, and saved dairy products put away in previous months. Upkeep work in this season was minimal, probably confined to maintaining the storage areas, inspecting for signs of spoilage, and making cautious use of what remained. In just right years, the shops lasted conveniently until spring. In lean years, rationing became crucial, and the bounds of preservation had been confirmed. The cycle was once no longer merely decline, additionally carried a specific rhythm of familiarity and lifestyle. Each season introduced its own set of duties, performed at roughly the identical time every year, more often than not in much the same method as they'd been for generations. Capabilities was once passed via remark and participation, children observing, their elders finding out no longer from books but from the repetition of action. The odor of smoking fish in summer season, the sound of grain being poured into bins in autumn, the sight of jars of pickled veggies lined up in a cellar, these have been the sensory markers of time in a medieval household. In the absence of refrigeration, renovation was certainly not excellent. There were always dangers: mold creeping right into a retailer of dried fruit, rodents finding a method into the granary, a batch of pickles turning smooth and sour in an disagreeable means. Yet, by means of expertise and adaptation, medieval people managed to preserve enough food secure to preserve themselves year after year. The success of this work was once measured no longer through entire avoidance of spoilage, however, by means of preserving adequate provisions to bridge the hole between harvests. Watching again, it is clear that medieval food maintenance used to be now not readily a matter of system. It used to be a technique of residing in stability with nature's offerings, making use of the instruments and conditions at hand, and accepting the boundaries imposed by using the atmosphere. The absence of refrigerators didn't mean the absence of safety or style. It intended that each chew in iciness carried with it the reminiscence of previous seasons, preserved via persistence, skill, and an unbroken chain of lifestyle. In this method, the renovation of meals used to be as a lot about retaining life itself. Each approach, whether cooling, drying, salting, fermenting, or storing, was part of a better, ongoing effort to weave security from the uncertainty of the seasons, guaranteeing that the family might greet the next spring with force, and the cycle as soon as again.